I'm Lisa K. Solomon, and this is How We Future, where I talk to some of my favorite changemakers about shaping tomorrow, starting today. Today, I'm joined by Futures Facilitator Jeff Rogers. Jeff doesn't just talk about possibilities, he creates experiences that help people live into them, test them, and feel them. In this episode, Jeff and I talk about how games are crucial in navigating complexity, and how to bridge the gap between our future selves and our present selves. Jeff also shares some of his favorite futures resources, including his sci-fi book collection. So if you're someone who doesn't only hope that things get better, but is ready to make them better, then let's dive in. Jeff Rogers, I'm so excited to welcome you to How We Future.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely a privilege and definitely a future that I have been anticipating with great excitement. Thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled. Well, we've known each other now for many years, which is an absolute benefit to me and the work I've been doing since meeting with you. Every time we talk, though, whether we're working on an actual project together or we're just hanging out, I always leave feeling more energized about what's possible. But there's probably a lot of folks listening to this that are meeting you for the first time. So I'm curious, how would you introduce yourself? Like when you tell people, this is what I do for a living at a dinner party or hanging out, what do you say?
It's usually an absolute disaster, kind of a train wreck intro. But I have been workshopping it for a long time, mostly by trying to help my parents understand what I was doing professionally. And I often actually default to futures facilitator. I do think of myself as a facilitator first and foremost, that I am there to support conversations, to design and facilitate experiences, and as much as possible, have those actually be in service of an exploration of futures. And so that's kind of where I like to start, futures facilitator, and sort of see how quizzical the look I get in response is, and then I'll go from there.
I love that, and I appreciate that you've actually been actively workshopping it, because
it's been a long-term challenge.
Well, listen, I have almost everyone in my family going, what exactly do you do? I mean, I know you do good stuff, but what exactly is it? And I think it is a challenge because it doesn't yet exist as a field. I think people know what a meeting is. They know what it's like to design or even facilitate a meeting. But this idea of facilitating futures is somewhat of a new concept. And one thing I've always appreciated about you, Jeff, is I've heard you say the future should not just be for the futurists. And this idea of bringing this work to more people. So
too important, in fact, to be left to the vanishingly small population that self-identifies as futurists, which also tends to kind of skew towards certain demographics. And I think one of the things that you and I have really shared over the years, and both centered in our work, is trying to make those conversations and those explorations more accessible and feel like they are more open, more inclusive, more participatory, that everybody has something to offer and that we can all learn from each other in doing this thing. And I also think one of the challenges of articulating exactly what it is that you or I do is that it takes different forms. Now, I could tell people, oh, I'm a workshop designer, or sometimes I make games. But part of the beauty, I think, is that we're always looking for and discovering new ways of helping people explore and experience futures. And it's kind of open-ended by design. I think that's the way it ought to be.
Yeah, I love that. And, I would sort of say that's the beauty of the design part, which is meeting people where they are, but having a point of view that we want to help people understand or interrogate future or possible futures in new ways. And I do think the future's on people's mind a lot, and particularly a lot more these days with the feeling that it's coming at us faster and faster. So pick your favorite geopolitical macro force coming at us. We hear a lot, for example, about AI that is really shaping the future and giving us a sense that there is maybe one future that's ahead of us versus what I think we try to do, which is to facilitate imagination of multiple futures. So, Jeff, we were talking about the fact that most people don't really understand what it means to be a futures facilitator. They know they want to gather people to talk about the future. What are some ways that you help people better understand how to approach the future? And maybe specifically, what are some things that they get wrong when thinking about the future?
Yeah, I think those are probably pretty closely entwined. And I'll start with the first one. I think one of the ways that I like to open futures conversations and bring people in is by emphasizing the fact that they already have this capability, right? And you and I talk about this all the time, that superpower of prospection, that we can all imagine futures and we can do interesting things with them. And we can even imagine multiple futures, right? Not just one. We can stay up at night thinking about all the things that could go wrong, right? Which the word for that would just be anxiety. But the other word is this prospection, and being able to kind of imagine forward and then recognizing not only that we have that capability, but that you can do cool things with it. If you can see a range of possible futures, you can start to ask yourself some questions like, which of these are favorable? Which ones would I like to make more probable? Are there things that I could do to increase the probability that one of these possible futures might actually be the one that we wind up with? And that's all really natural, and actually being intentional about it is where people can discover some of their agency. So I think that's a lot of ultimately what we're trying to do. But starting from the point of helping people recognize that they all have this capability and probably just undervalue and underutilize and underappreciate it.
I love that framing so much. It always reminds me of like the Wizard of Oz lesson, like it's in you all along. So I'm not sure we all have the red ruby slippers of, maybe we do, a future's agency, right? It's in us. And that last point about it being undervalued and underutilized. And I think, Jeff, you come to this work from a very unique place, which is that you've worked and spent a lot of time with our youngest futurists, helping teach them how to grow and learn and develop themselves. And I know that was hugely formative for you and your approach. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work with some early folks in experiential ways and how that's informed now the work that you're doing with executives and leadership teams across the world.
Happy to. And this is one of the fun things we get to do as creatures who can think forward and backward in time. I can look back on my very messy, nonlinear career path, and now I can project some coherence on it in retrospect. And one of the things, if I had to stitch a red thread between the early years that I was kind of feeling out what I could do in the world, I did do quite a bit of work in experiential learning and outdoor education and youth leadership development. I took kids on backpacking trips in the Sierra. I was a sailing camp instructor for a while. I have had a lot of different roles from that time, getting eventually into, corporate learning and development and executive leadership and the futures focus. But in every stop along that career path, I think I was trying to help people do things together that they didn't necessarily feel like they could do on their own, or that they couldn't do as well on their own. And I love that collaborative aspect of it. And I also really like some of those early things that you emphasize in experiential education and youth leadership, getting people to step outside of their comfort zone, getting them to try new things, getting them to be open and okay with being wrong. And when it comes to futures, we're going to be wrong about all kinds of things. And we need to be. What we want is not to be able to, we would love to be able to precisely forecast everything, but that is an illusion, right? We'll never get there. But what we might be able to do is be wrong in interesting ways, and ways that actually give us a new perspective on choices and paths and contingencies, and some of that same spirit of tapping curiosity and a passion for exploration and discovery, and kind of a collaborative journey, an experience that we're going to build together. That I can kind of pull pretty neatly from some of those early years. And I would also add to that, just in terms of how we engage people, and particularly how I approach the craft of facilitation. I think a lot of the things that I do well now are things I learned working with kids. And I'm very big on play as a modality for learning and exploration. And we all recognize that it works really great for the little animal. And then at some point we say, oh, well, now that the animal's bigger, they need PowerPoint decks and white papers. And those are fine things, but there are other great ways of exploring and imagining. And often I think that can and should involve play.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Totally agree. You and I, one of the most fun things that we do when we work together is to think about how do we introduce this game, or how do we get them to be more playful in a way that doesn't trigger this huge threat response? Because as you said, somewhere along the way said, hey, as you've gotten bigger, let's get more serious. Even when we have research that suggests we learn better during play, we work better with others during play, but yet nobody says we have a really difficult problem to solve. Let's go play a game.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, speaking games, you play a lot of great games, and I wonder if you want to share maybe a game or two, because one of the things we want to do in How We Future is make this very practical and tangible. So do you have a favorite game or two, Jeff, that you love to play with us older animals who may be a little bit more resistant to the idea of play?
Yeah, I'll start with one that is not actually a game straight up, but it is kind of an imaginative activity that I think is really powerful in opening people to conversations about futures and also their agency in shaping them. And I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I have some friends at a innovation and kind of L&D agency called Stoked, and this is one of their favorites. You probably know some of these people through the design school at Stanford. They have connections there, but one of their favorites that I have enjoyed co-facilitating with them is something we'll do often at the beginning of like a high-level leadership executive education program that's going to have a futuring component. We'll ask them as kind of a preparatory piece to do a quick interview, talk with someone that is maybe a family member, someone close to them, ideally a young person, like if they have a child or a niece or a nephew, something like that, and ask them to describe the future that they imagine for themselves 10 years or 15 years down the line. Maybe even illustrate it. That adds an extra layer of fun. But they'll all do this, and they'll have their little interview. They'll hear from this young person who in some way is connected to and meaningful to them. And then they'll come to the program and they'll share that out. And we'll also ask them about how they felt when they were hearing about this future. Where were they surprised? What resonated with them? What was their response as they were listening? And almost inevitably, these adults find as they're hearing these visions of the future that they start to ask themselves reflexively what their role in it is. How could they make that vision a reality for this young person that they care about? What could they start to do today to make that future a little bit more likely, to bring it a little bit closer, to kind of be a steward of this imagination, of this vision of a possible, and in this case, a preferred future that they in some way are already connected to and that they care about, that they're invested in because it matters to someone else. And so already they're starting to discover their agency. They're starting to think about how they put the present in service of the possible future, how they connect their actions today toward a vision of tomorrow, and one that, ultimately is probably going to play out and extend beyond their own lifetime. And I mean, all of that winds up being really powerful just in kind of orienting you to connecting your imagination of possibilities and maybe even seeing some possibilities that didn't occur to you immediately. That opens you to that wider range of possible futures, and then using them. Like actually using them to get a new perspective on what you can do as a partner or as a parent or as a friend today. And I think that's a tremendously powerful, simple thing. I love it.
Sounds amazing. And there's so many things embodied in that modality of, first of all, this idea that we have the power, as you said earlier, to prospect, to imagine a future that's a little bit further out than maybe we're comfortable with. And that intentional prompt to think about it and put some texture to it. And as you said, maybe even illustrate it, taps into other parts of our brain to make it more concrete. And that design and simplicity, I think, gets at some interesting research I've read from Hal Hirschfield over at UCLA that talks about the fact that we tend to think of our future selves as strangers, that there's something when we get too far out that feels so disconnected from where we recognize ourselves today that we don't even make that connection that it's the same person. And if you think of your future self as a stranger, then in many ways you're not going to have the same level of empathy that you might have. And so that just small, even fun exercise that may seem super simple and easy at the time, but actually gets into these deeper layers is such a powerful way to kind of break some of those barriers.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that's a lot of why it works so well.
There's another game I've seen you play that I have to ask you about, which is to help leaders get more comfortable with emerging complexity. And to do that in an incredibly experiential and immersive way that is very fun, but also has quite the kicker of a punchline. And I wonder if you could talk about that one.
Absolutely. And as I did with the previous interaction, I want to give a little bit of attribution and lineage to this. I know that this game has been floating around for a long time. In fact, one day I spent an afternoon trying to chase down the origins online, and I was able to get back to the early aughts. Actually found a collection online of summer camp and youth leadership activities. And this was in there, which was interesting. Now, I didn't learn it until probably about 10 years ago. And I encountered it actually from a friend of yours. Robert Poynton was the first person to show me the chair game. And you can read about it online. I know Rob's written about it. Other people have written about it as well. But the premise is pretty simple. And it is a kind of human systems dynamics game. And the dynamics play out in ways that are really rich and actually allow for a range of possible frames. And I like to talk about this game in that context of navigating uncertainty and complexity in an environment where you have limited information and limited influence. But I'm sure when this is framed for, youth leadership at a summer camp, it's probably a lot more about collaboration and communication and listening to and learning from others, understanding how you can be a good leader and also how you can be a good team member. But the thing is wonderful in its simplicity and emerging complexity. The idea is that you have a group of participants in a pretty open game space with one chair per person. And for reasons that will soon become apparent, I think it's good that the chairs don't roll. So you have one chair per person, and the chairs are kind of randomly distributed with enough room to walk between any of them safely. So a few feet between each chair. And you ask one person to stand up. So now there is an empty chair, and that person now becomes what I call the chair zombie. And the chair zombie has one goal in mind, and they are looking for an open chair to sit down. Right now, it's the chair that they got up from. They have to walk. And it's not the new school zombie where they're super, super fast. I like them to be kind of lumbering. Also makes things a little bit safer for everybody involved. But they are walking and they are trying to occupy an open chair. Everybody else gets to work together. They get to work on a team. They also have one goal, and it's to keep the chair zombie from getting into that open chair. And they cannot restrain the zombie physically. They can't hold them back. They can't form a wall and block them. The way that they keep the zombie from getting the open chair is by occupying it. And if anybody gets up to move to a chair, they have to go to a different one before they come back to the chair they started in. You can't kind of get up and pop back down, right? If you're up, you're up. And they cannot move the chairs. That's the other rule. And that's pretty much it. It's really simple, and you present it to people, and they're like, oh, yeah, sounds easy. And this is kind of the beauty. It sounds easy, but it's not, because you have to do it with other people. And you don't know exactly how the other people in the room are going to respond once the game starts. And usually I find I like to run it with at least 20 people. I have played it with up to about 150, and that gets pretty raucous.
Sounds dangerous.
Yeah, but usually the first round goes for somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds and is an absolute disaster, and people are mystified by how difficult this thing turned out to be. And I like to play several rounds, and after every round, ask people what happened. And it gives them an opportunity to reflect. It gives them an opportunity to point fingers, if that's the kind of crowd it is. It gives them an opportunity to ask questions for clarification. I played the game one time, and it was an intact corporate team, and they played the first round in total silence. And only afterward, they said, hey, Jeff, are we allowed to talk to each other?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, which is
amazing.
A beautiful moment. Yeah, because you ask,
amazing.
well, why would you think you couldn't? And that actually surfaces an interesting learning that very often in an unfamiliar, uncertain environment, we try to draw on analogous experiences, things that seem like they might be valuable points of reference. You're like, oh, I've played something like this. And very often we assume boundaries and limitations that may not exist. And that's actually a thing you can take out into the real world. Like, how often are you in an unfamiliar environment and you don't actually explore it as thoroughly as you could, or you don't ask for clarification? And instead, you might be assuming that certain options are on the table or off the table. That might not be the case. And I would argue that that's often how people approach futures. We don't actually fully explore the limits and contours of our agency, and we just assume that some things are fixed or they can't be done.
It's fantastic. I've watched you play that game, but hearing you describe it in this way allows me to even understand its brilliance at a whole other level. Reminds me of a great quote that you can learn more from an hour of play than a year of conversation. And I just think about all of the different levels of debrief and conversation you can have from that, as you were saying, anything from what are our cultural norms? How do we show up? This idea that like we just assumed we couldn't speak. Like, what does that say about the culture? What does it say about collaboration and trust? What does it say about our own beliefs about being better at something than we might actually be? I mean, as you described it this way, I never really thought about it as a derivation of musical chairs, a game we played when we were all young. But if you think about musical chairs, which is super fun and could get a little raucous too, the cues involved are a little bit more linear and bounded than what you're describing in the chair zombie games. There it's like music cue off on.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the chairs are in a row, not scattered. And so sometimes we can think that because it feels a little familiar, we're going to be expert at it, except when you add new things, wow, you actually learn and have done in a safe way. It can be humbling to open you up to be more curious. And then going back to this wonderful point you made earlier about our natural abilities as humans to both reflect, like what happened, in order to prospect, what could happen, and to do that in a way that has an element of fun, but also has a lot of seriousness behind it.
Yeah, and that game, and this is part of why games are so great for learning and exploration in general. It creates an extremely low stakes environment to explore concepts and ideas that can be very fraught. So how we navigate complexity, how we show up as a leader and a learner when we have limited information, limited influence, and we can't necessarily just tell everybody what to do top down. It allows us to explore that kind of thing in a space where the outcome doesn't matter. And actually, you learn faster and tend to make progress in a game like that by running quick cycles. And I'll often open the floor for people to, because I'll always say after the first round, well, we didn't have a strategy. We didn't have a plan. And I say, okay, great. I'll give you a minute and you can decide on what to do. You can coordinate. And it's always interesting there too, to see how long they'll debate what they should do. And someone inevitably will say, well, we should have one person telling everyone what to do, which, as you can imagine, is set up for failure. But it's interesting to see that sometimes they have this bias toward, well, we should debate the thing to death before we just try something new. And you've given them an environment where the cost of running an experiment is basically zero. And they have a really good opportunity to quickly validate or invalidate an approach and learn. And that's another thing that people can kind of take away is, what are my biases? When the game starts, if I'm thinking musical chairs, what do you do in musical chairs? Well, you keep moving. You all stand up and start moving. But this is a game where actually that's making it more complicated. And it's a really beautifully designed interaction that I, now playing this for, I think, close to 10 years, I feel like I still see new things that are rich and transferable, aside from the fact that it's just super fun. It's great.
It's great. I mean, super fun. So I know you work with a lot of leaders, Jeff, and again, we're trying to make this practical for folks and fun, to open up their horizons, that there's lots of different ways to approach the future. There's no one right way. This isn't a show for a recipe or a single process, but the future feels pretty serious right now. I mean, there's a lot happening that is, as my colleague Scott Dorley says, that is making our nervous systems nervous. So when you are working with a leader or a group that knows they want to bring people together to talk about the future and serious issues, how do you help them get comfortable that this lighter side, or perhaps a little bit more game oriented or play oriented approach might actually be more effective? Like, what are just some ways that exchange unfolds, just to give people that are looking for new approaches, that are hoping that it might actually be fun, and that fun part doesn't necessarily take away from the seriousness? I'm just curious about tips you might have of trying to get more people more comfortable with this kind of way of entering into conversations about the future.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I like often to start with something that feels very relatable and very human, and not overburden things with jargon and terminology and heavy conceptual frameworks. I'll introduce the idea of prospection, but through that kind of interaction I talked about, where, it actually starts with you exploring a future that you are connected to and care about, and might reflexively assume a position of stewardship and care for. And then you can pretty easily connect that to, if you wanted to, within the organization, that you may actually be enabling a set of futures for your teams, for your employees, for your stakeholders, and they may have things that they desire, that they want, and you have an opportunity to understand those visions by starting those conversations and listening, and then reflecting on, asking yourself, well, what can I do with these? What is my role? What is my responsibility? And I think having an entry point like that is at once accessible, but also, I think, pretty deeply resonant. And people see that there is a creative practice here, but also it's getting to something serious. And same with that chair game. I will frame it up as a game, and we will have fun, but as we go, I will push harder and harder on some of those things that I think will be valuable takeaways for a leader and for a learner and for a team within an organization. And for me, a lot of the craft of facilitation, as I try to practice it, is being able to kind of toggle between these moments that feel exploratory, open-ended, freeing, creative, and then actually reflecting on those and asking, well, what do we take from that experience? And this is actually something I picked up from you, that, the future is an area where we don't have any experts. There's not somebody in the room that we can turn to who's going to tell us everything we need to know about the future. Instead, we can try to design experiences that allow us to learn, that allow us to ask new questions that might be rich and valuable. So kind of easing people into the creative practice of it, so then we can do some of the analytical reflection, synthesis, distillation. But I think the two need to go hand in hand. And if you have all of one and not the other, you're not maximizing the value of the experience.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much I love in that. What I hear you say is really having a lot of empathy for where the group is, where the team is, where the leader is at that moment, and trying to work with them to help them grow and shift and move enough that it really might open up, versus kind of break them because you're pushing too fast. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, Jeff, but I just, as I hear you talk about where you are now, I am transported back in time to some of the earliest experiences that you and I designed for our colleagues to help them open up their sense of discovery, their connection with each other, their capabilities to be collaborative. And one of my absolute favorite ones was when you and I took a number of our colleagues to Soul Cycle in order to experience what experiences are like. And I wonder, what do you remember from that?
Primarily what I remember was that spin classes, especially where they involve some kind of element of dancing in the saddle while waving weights around, are way harder than I had anticipated. And that was a time in my life where I was doing a lot of cycling. But yeah, I was pretty gassed. It turned out to be a learning experience for me in that respect. As far as what I remember about that primarily, and what I took away from the experience myself, was really just kind of a lesson in thinking across experiences and working with analogies. And, there's something in there, depending on what your role in the company that you're representing is. You go to SoulCycle and maybe you think about, well, what is this like as a designed experience? What is this like as an experience for a customer or a user? How is it structured? How is it scaffolded? How is it supported? How is it delivered? How do we make this thing work for people who are coming in, again, at like a very wide range of abilities or fitness in that case? Like there's really some interesting stuff to be done there in how do you make sure that everyone walks away at the end of this thing feeling good, not feeling crushed, defeated, horrible.
Right.
And when we're talking about futures and we're talking about the practice of futures and futuring in a world that can feel overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming and disorienting and in some cases crushing, how do we actually structure those experiences so that whatever you're bringing to the table, whatever perspective or mindset you walk in with, you actually walk out feeling enriched and even perhaps empowered or equipped or enabled. And in a sense, I think there's something similar there to mind.
Absolutely. I love the reflection. It is true. In the moment, we're like, wow, that was a sweaty surprise. But I think it had all of those things. And there's an interesting nuance here too that I just want to share for folks that are, again, wondering how do I bring in a different kind of experience, or how do I take a leap of faith to try to facilitate a different kind of conversation. I think one of the small positive choices we made there was to bring in, if you can think of SoulCycle as a partner. We didn't have to design all that. SoulCycle had an experience and they were good at it. And you and I recognized that we could leverage what they did well, that moment in time where SoulCycle was the peak of its popularity. And so there was a cool factor to it. There was a destination. We weren't prescribing, hey, when we go to SoulCycle, look for this, look for this, look for this. It was just go and experience it. Everyone had their own experience. And then we unpacked it. And what I remember is that people came away from that with so many different takeaways that were actually quite useful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anything from like, wow, that turnover team, the 15 minutes in between classes, it's like a NASCAR pit crew. Like, what were they doing, right? Everyone had a job and there was something about the efficiency there. I love the fact that our IT department, we had several members there. And what they took away from it was the fact that, like, before you go to SoulCycle, on the counter, they have everything that you might need to get you through the class. They had hair ties if you need to pull back your hair. They had a piece of gum if you needed a little something. They were anticipating choking, yeah, that too, after the waiver. But they were anticipating what you might need. And I remember our IT guys were like, wait a minute, why do we ask people to fill out a long check form or, you know, something to get it serviced? Let's just have the things, the basic things that people need available to them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there was a whole program team that saw the kind of the arc of the experience. Oh, there's a warm up, and then there's some hard stuff in the middle. At some point, there's arms, and there's a cool down. There's mantras in between. The wall has this cool saying on it. You know, so there's just so much to get. And I think that's another passion you and I have, which is to take experiences in the everyday and say, wait, what can we learn from that? How could we get better? How could we connect? And you are just one of the most masterful people I know at doing that. Taking what's available and using it as fodder. One of the many, many reasons why you're one of my first phone calls, particularly when I'm working on something difficult, because I know you're going to have that holistic sensibility that it's not serious things doesn't just have to be serious. In fact, serious issues are perhaps the precise moment to bring in something surprising or novel or different to make sure that we're not getting in that defensive mode, but we're asking ourselves, are there ways to open up? So Jeff, I could talk to you forever, as you know. And I can already tell you're going to be coming back. But I want to end with some final kind of gifts maybe to our listeners. And you may recall that in the book I wrote about designing conversations called Moments of Impact, one of my favorite parts about that book is the starter kit we had at the back. That was the like, look, we wrote this book, but we also know you all are very busy people and probably won't have time to read all of it. So just go to the back, the starter kit, where we say, hey, ask these questions, try these things, read these things. So I want to end in that same spirit of really helping give people some cliff notes of some useful things to do. So the first question I want to ask you is, what are some questions that people should be asking, particularly if they're interested in more expansive approaches to the future, whether in their personal lives or professional lives? Are there great questions maybe they should be asking themselves or their colleagues?
Everybody needs the cliff notes. You know, it's not just if you're new to it, this is a developing field. So I'm very excited about it and happy to contribute a little bit. So questions that I think are particularly rich or useful or fun. I'm one of the first that's come up quite a bit in this conversation is just asking yourself or your team, whatever group you're talking futures with, how our present actions or strategy, leadership, what have you, how that actually aligns with the futures that we want to enable. And now there's not a direct linear thing where we can say, I do this today, and it creates this perfectly in accord vision of tomorrow 5 years down the line. Instead, it's always probabilistically, and it's thinking about what kinds of bets can we be making in the present that might increase the likelihood of a future? What are some little things that we can nudge while also learning in the right direction so that we're refining our vision of the future or futures as we're working towards our preferred futures? And I think that is like a continuous reflective practice of just asking yourself, are these really aligned? Am I using today to serve the tomorrows that I want to see?
I love that question. It really connects with something I've heard you say a lot around learning with the future and not having a sort of antagonistic response to it. So I love that question around alignment and that it's an ongoing question. It's not one and done. This
is another thing that I'm always thinking about, and we've talked about a little bit, and also kind of ties back to my early youth leadership days. I remember I had a couple of experiences where I had a group of teenagers for a few weeks, and they were from all over the country, and they didn't know each other. Some of them were away from home for the first time on like a backpacking trip. And at the beginning, I would remind them that they had perhaps a unique opportunity, that they're away from their family, they're away from their friends, they're away from all the things that people already know or assume about them. And they have an opportunity to kind of think about who they would like to be. And they can practice some new things. They might be able to kind of treat this as an opportunity to explore who they would like to return as when they go back to their world. And maybe if you're a little more shy, this is a time where you play with a new behavior of being a little bit more outgoing. And I was always happy to talk with them about how they might do or be that thing. And, very often that one actually is by asking other people more questions. Or if you're someone who talks a lot, maybe this is a time where you try listening a little bit more. And that's another thing that I always try to emphasize when leaders and learners are thinking about the future, to remember that we're not just prototyping and designing futures, we're also prototyping and designing our future selves. That you too are a prototype, and you can kind of reflect on who or how you would be if you were designing a character and you dialed up this aspect of yourself plus 10 points. Or I'm going to give myself a new superpower that I can try here in this situation. This is another place where gameplay is really great. But I really encourage that, like thinking about prototyping your future self by picking up and exploring new practices today, playing with them.
Thinking about your choices through the lens of a prototype for yourself and your future self is something we can all try in that way.
Yeah, or I remember actually attending a web session that you hosted at Stanford a couple years ago where you had Leah Zaidi, another futurist that you and I are both fans of. And she talked on that session about approaching early stages of your career and professional development as kind of LARPing. That, you could try these different things and kind of explore them and experiment in them. And I think we can do the same to a certain extent with some of our behaviors and our mindsets and, maybe even again, some of the things that we want to experiment with developing as practices that might actually prove adaptive as we're continuing to navigate this uncertain future.
Bringing back the LARPing. I love it. For those of you that are not into gaming jargon, LARPing stands for live action role play. But I love that though, because the format of that asks you to take on different personas, which, as you said, might be an accelerating move to get us to become more adaptable. I mean, we can. So that's fantastic. Okay, Jeff, my last question for you, because I know you are a voracious learner. Suggestions on resources or places where people can read or listen, opportunities for them to broaden their own horizons.
I'm going to give you some suggestions that I think you won't get from other people. And I'm also going to push a little bit further afield and not just give futures stuff. Although I can do that. I understand that Lisa K. Solomon has a fantastic LinkedIn learning course, Leading as a Futurist, which definitely recommend.
Okay, thank you we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Yes, we did it. We did it. I got it in.
Longest promo ever.
Yes, send the check to, I mean, that is a great starting point, I will say, and it is easily accessible. I would also say for people who are interested in kind of the, futures facilitation piece, How to Future. Scott Smith, that's right. Yeah, Scott Smith. That's a great toolkit. It's really accessible. That's another book that I go back to often. Game Storming as well is one. And if you kind of commingle those books and you get a bunch of interesting futures ideas and then some games and frames from Game Storming, like you're off to the races, you're ready to design workshops. But the things I wanted to get into that are maybe less likely to pop up elsewhere. I love books that get you to think about time and time scales. And one that I came across recently that I really enjoyed was called Timefulness by a geologist named Marcia Bjornerud. And it is a beautiful book that gets you to think as a geologist and also in a certain sense, like think about time on geologic non-human scales. And then, of course, it does relate back to the human scale and the decisions we make and the systems we build and how those interact with and ultimately affect these larger geologic scales and processes. And it's a beautiful thing. And I like stepping out of our kind of human bias in that sense. And kind of related to that, I'm a big sci-fi fan. And I can't do this and not recommend some science fiction. So one of my favorite sci-fi books that I think is underread, perhaps, there's a great sci-fi writer named Jeff Vandermeer who's written a bunch of stuff that's awesome. But one of my favorites of his is called Born. And it is a dystopian future. It's a ripping story. And it also has some non-human characters that you develop surprisingly deep empathic connection to. And I was in tears at the end of that book. And part of what I thought was so remarkable about it is that you do find yourself relating to and feeling deep empathy for this weird range of entities. And the level of wizardry involved in telling a story like that is that weird and that affecting, I think is really awesome and is a great thing when we're thinking about futures and stewardship of futures. We have an opportunity to kind of broaden the scope of our empathy and think about who and what we need to be taking care of and looking out for. And I love it. Highly recommended.
Can't wait to check it out. Wizardry and weird storytelling. Love it. Love it. And I know that you love to also go see those movies as well, those great stories. And again, I just want to say, first of all, my huge appreciation for you, Jeff, for being on this journey with me, not only of this new journey of this podcast, but journey in the futures life and in life more generally. Not only are you a fantastic futures facilitator, you are a phenomenal friend. And I am so lucky and grateful to have you as my learning partner and as a fellow life journey person trying to make sense of this wacky world we're in. And I just want to say how much I appreciate your spirit of generosity and how I've observed over the years that your combination of curiosity, belief in the possibility, belief that we have agency in creating futures, and your spirit of care is in and of itself a adaptive, resilient, proactive stance towards the future. And I have benefited from that greatly myself. So I want to thank you for all of those things and truly thank you for believing in this project and saying yes to having this conversation with me.
Absolutely. Fully and warmly reciprocated. Lisa, you're the best. And I very much look forward to seeing the futures that you shape through your work and hope to be involved as long as I can. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How We Future featuring Jeff Rogers. It was super fun to hear Jeff's approach to inviting more people to imagine futures through play and games. Share zombie game, anyone? I hope you'll join me next time for more conversations on shaping the future optimistically, practically, and intentionally. I'm Lisa K. Solomon, and I hope you have a great week.